The British monarchy just wielded a power that hasn't been used in decades, and Parliament has erupted into absolute chaos. King Charles has done the unthinkable, blocking a major reform bill from Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and what happened next inside Westminster has shocked the entire nation. MPs are at each other's throats. The government is in crisis mode, and constitutional experts are calling this the biggest showdown between Crown and Parliament since the 1700s. This isn't just political drama, this is a full-blown constitutional earthquake that could change Britain forever. Buckle up, because what you're about to discover will leave you speechless. Just 1 minute ago, news broke that has sent shockwaves through every corner of the United Kingdom. King Charles has formally blocked Prime Minister Keir Starmer's controversial reform bill, a move so extraordinary that most constitutional scholars thought they'd never see it in their lifetime. The King exercised something called royal assent refusal, a power that technically exists but hasn't been used by a British monarch since Queen Anne in 1708. That's over 300 years of precedent shattered in a single moment. The reform bill in question was Starmer's flagship legislation designed to fundamentally restructure the relationship between Parliament and the Crown, redistributing powers that have remained with the monarchy for centuries. It was supposed to be a new era for Britain, a modernisation that would strip away what Labour called outdated royal privileges and transfer them directly to elected officials. The bill had passed through the Commons with a slim majority after weeks of brutal debate, survived challenges in the Lords, and was heading toward what everyone assumed would be the formality of royal assent. But then everything changed. Sources inside Buckingham Palace reveal that King Charles had been in intense private consultations with constitutional advisors for days leading up to this moment. The King reportedly expressed deep concerns that the reform bill violated fundamental principles of the British Constitution, particularly provisions that would have given Parliament direct control over royal appointments, ceremonial duties, and even aspects of the Commonwealth relationships. While the monarch is typically expected to remain politically neutral and grant royal assent as a formality, Charles apparently concluded that this bill crossed a red line, threatening the very foundation of constitutional monarchy itself. The decision to refuse assent wasn't made lightly. Palace insiders say the King personally reviewed every clause, consulted with former prime ministers, legal scholars, and even reached out to Commonwealth leaders who would be affected by the changes. The message from the palace was clear. This wasn't about politics. This was about protecting constitutional balance. The moment the announcement hit, Parliament descended into scenes never witnessed in modern British history. MPs who had spent months crafting and debating the reform bill stood in stunned silence as the Speaker read the formal notification of the King's refusal. Then the chamber exploded. Labour backbenchers began shouting accusations of constitutional coup, demanding emergency sessions and calling for immediate abolition of royal assent powers altogether. Conservative MPs, many of whom had opposed the reform bill from the start, erupted in cheers and applause, seeing the King's action as a necessary intervention against governmental overreach. The Speaker struggled to maintain order as MPs from both sides screamed over each other, with some Labour members reportedly calling the monarchy obsolete and demanding a referendum on abolishing it entirely. The scenes were so chaotic that the session had to be suspended 3 times within the first hour, with security actually having to separate MPs who were getting physically confrontational in the corridors afterward. Prime Minister Keir Starmer emerged from an emergency cabinet meeting with a face like thunder. In a hastily arranged press conference outside Number 10, Starmer stood before a sea of cameras and journalists, his voice barely containing his fury. He called the King's decision an unacceptable interference in democratic processes, stating that elected representatives, not unelected monarchs, should have the final say on the laws that govern Britain. Starmer stopped just short of directly criticising King Charles personally, but his words left no doubt about his position. He announced that his government would be exploring all constitutional options to override the refusal, including potential legislation to remove or severely limit the royal assent power permanently. The Prime Minister made it clear that his reform bill represented the will of the people as expressed through their elected parliament, and that will should not be subject to royal veto. He pledged that Labour would not back down, that they would fight this decision through every legal and constitutional means available, and that the reform bill would eventually become law regardless of the palace's objections. But Starmer's defiance has created a massive split, not just between government and Crown, but within his own party and across the entire political landscape. Senior Labour figures are divided on how to respond. Some are backing Starmer's aggressive stance, arguing that this is exactly why the monarchy needs to be reformed or abolished, that no single individual should have the power to block the democratic will of Parliament. Others, including some of Labour's more moderate voices, are privately expressing concern that picking a fight with the newly crowned king could backfire spectacularly with the British public, many of whom still hold deep affection for the monarchy despite supporting some reforms. Meanwhile, the Conservative opposition has found renewed energy, with party leaders declaring that King Charles has done his constitutional duty by preventing what they call a dangerous power grab by an overreaching Labour government. They're framing the king as a defender of British traditions and constitutional balance, standing up against radical changes that would have undermined centuries of carefully evolved governance. The constitutional implications of what just happened are absolutely staggering, and experts are scrambling to analyse every angle of this unprecedented situation. Royal assent has been a formality for so long that most modern constitutional law textbooks treat it as basically ceremonial, a rubber stamp that the monarch provides without question, because that's how constitutional monarchy works in a democracy. The last time a British monarch refused royal assent was Queen Anne's rejection of the Scottish Militia Bill in 1708. And even that was done on the advice of her ministers, making King Charles's action truly unique in modern history. Constitutional scholars are now debating whether the king even had the legal right to do what he did, with some arguing that centuries of convention have effectively removed this power through disuse, while others insist that because it was never formally abolished, it technically still exists and was legitimately exercised. The legal arguments are incredibly complex, involving interpretations of everything from the Bill of Rights of 1689 to various constitutional conventions that have developed over 3 centuries. What makes this situation even more explosive is the content of the reform bill itself and why it triggered such a dramatic response from the palace. The legislation wasn't just making minor adjustments to royal responsibilities, it was fundamentally restructuring the constitutional relationship between Crown and Parliament in ways that hadn't been attempted since the English Civil War era. Key provisions would have transferred the power to appoint bishops in the Church of England from the Crown to a parliamentary committee, stripped the monarch of any role in Commonwealth governance, and created an elected oversight body with the authority to review and potentially override royal decisions on everything from honours to ceremonial functions. The bill would have essentially converted the British monarchy from a constitutional institution with specific reserved powers into a purely symbolic figurehead with zero independent authority. For King Charles, who takes his role as defender of the faith and Commonwealth head seriously, these changes apparently represented an existential threat not just to the monarchy, but to Britain's entire constitutional structure. Inside Westminster, the chaos has only intensified as MPs return from the initial shock and begin calculating their next moves. Emergency debates have been scheduled, with both the Commons and the Lords preparing for what could be weeks of constitutional warfare. Labour's leadership is reportedly drafting new legislation that would explicitly remove the royal assent power, making it impossible for any future monarch to block parliamentary bills. They're calling it the Democratic Sovereignty Act, and early drafts suggest it would be even more radical than the original reform bill, potentially triggering another constitutional showdown. The problem Starmer faces is numbers. While Labour holds a majority in the Commons, it's not overwhelming, and there are enough Labour MPs uncomfortable with attacking the monarchy directly that passing such legislation isn't guaranteed. In the Lords, where the bill would also need approval, Conservative peers are already organising massive resistance, and even some crossbench and Labour Lords are expressing reservations about stripping royal powers in response to what they see as the King legitimately exercising constitutional authority. The British public's reaction has been just as divided as Parliament's, with opinion polls conducted in the hours since the announcement showing the nation split almost exactly down the middle. Roughly half of Britons support King Charles's decision, viewing it as a necessary check on governmental power and a defence of constitutional traditions that make Britain unique. Many in this camp argue that the monarchy serves as a crucial non-partisan safeguard against political extremism, and that removing royal powers entirely would leave the country vulnerable to unchecked governmental authority. The other half is furious, seeing the King's action as an undemocratic interference by an unelected individual in the democratic process, arguing that in the 21st century, no single person should have the power to overrule the elected representatives of the people. Social media has exploded with hashtags on both sides, with supporters trending things like "Stand with the King" and "Defend our Constitution," while opponents are pushing "Abolish the monarchy" and "Democracy, not royalty." Protest rallies are being organised in London for the coming days by both pro and anti-monarchy groups, and there are genuine concerns about potential civil unrest. International reactions are pouring in, and they're adding another layer of complexity to this already tangled situation. Commonwealth nations are watching with intense interest because the reform bill would have affected the King's role as Commonwealth head, potentially weakening ties that have existed for generations. Leaders from Australia, Canada, New Zealand and other Commonwealth countries have remained diplomatically cautious in their public statements, but behind the scenes, many are reportedly relieved that the reforms were blocked, fearing that diminishing the Crown's Commonwealth role could have destabilised the entire organisation. The United States and European Union have issued carefully worded statements about respecting British sovereignty and constitutional processes, but political analysts in Washington and Brussels are privately expressing concern that a full-blown constitutional crisis in the UK could have serious implications for international relations, particularly at a time when Western democracies are already facing numerous challenges. Financial markets initially responded negatively to the news, with the pound dropping slightly on uncertainty concerns, though it has since stabilised as investors wait to see how the situation develops. What happens next is the question everyone is asking, and the honest answer is that nobody really knows, because Britain has never been in this exact situation before. The government has several options, none of them simple. Starmer could attempt to reintroduce a modified version of the reform bill, addressing the King's specific objections while maintaining the core intent of the legislation, hoping that a compromise might receive royal assent. He could push forward with new legislation to abolish or severely limit the royal assent power, though this risks expanding the constitutional crisis rather than resolving it. There's even talk of calling a snap general election to get a direct mandate from the people on the monarchy's roll, effectively turning the next election into a referendum on the constitution itself. The palace, meanwhile, is in an extremely delicate position. King Charles has made his stand, but he knows that pushing too hard could trigger a Republican movement that ends the monarchy altogether. Royal sources suggest the King is open to dialogue and compromise, but not on fundamental constitutional principles that he believes are essential to Britain's governmental structure. Behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere is described as tense but resolute, with the King's closest advisors working around the clock to manage the fallout from the most controversial royal decision in modern history. King Charles reportedly spent hours after making his decision personally calling key figures across British society, from religious leaders to military commanders to business leaders, explaining his reasoning and seeking to build support for his position. The King's argument, according to those who have spoken with him, is straightforward. He took an oath at his coronation to uphold the constitution and traditions of the United Kingdom, and the reform bill would have violated that oath by fundamentally dismantling constitutional structures that have served Britain for centuries. Charles is said to believe that the role of constitutional monarch includes serving as a last resort safeguard against legislation that threatens the constitutional order itself, and that this situation demanded he exercise that responsibility regardless of the political consequences. The palace has begun a careful public relations campaign, releasing historical documents and constitutional analyses that support the king's legal authority to refuse assent, attempting to demonstrate that this wasn't an impulsive or politically motivated decision, but a carefully considered constitutional action. The Labour Party is now facing its own internal crisis as different factions battle over how to respond to the King's unprecedented move. The party's left wing is demanding immediate and aggressive action, calling for the abolition of the monarchy entirely and the establishment of a republic with a ceremonial elected president. They're arguing that this moment proves the fundamental incompatibility of hereditary monarchy with modern democracy, and that Labour should seize this opportunity to finally complete the democratisation of British governance. The party's moderate wing is urging caution, warning that attacking the popular king could alienate vast numbers of voters who might support constitutional reform but aren't ready to abolish the monarchy altogether. Some senior Labour figures are privately furious with Starmer for pushing a reform bill so radical that it triggered this crisis in the first place, arguing that a more incremental approach to constitutional change might have achieved reforms without provoking royal intervention. Emergency meetings of the Parliamentary Labour Party have become heated affairs, with MPs shouting at each other over strategy, and there are rumours that some frontbenchers are considering resignation if Starmer pursues the most aggressive anti-monarchy options. The Conservative Party, meanwhile, is experiencing something of a renaissance after months of opposition struggles. Party leaders have rallied around the King's decision with enthusiasm, seeing it as vindication of their warnings that Labour's reforms went too far, too fast. The Conservatives are framing this entire situation as an example of what they call Labour's constitutional recklessness, arguing that Starmer's government was willing to tear down centuries of carefully balanced governance for short-term political gain. They're positioning themselves as defenders of British tradition and constitutional stability, launching a coordinated media campaign that presents the monarchy as an essential safeguard against governmental excess. Conservative MPs are filing parliamentary questions demanding to know what legal advice the government received before attempting to push through such radical reforms, and whether ministers were warned that the king might exercise his right to refuse assent. The party is preparing a massive opposition campaign against any Labour legislation attempting to abolish royal powers, promising to use every parliamentary procedure available to block such changes. Legal experts and constitutional scholars have become the most sought-after voices in British media as everyone tries to understand the intricacies of this unprecedented situation. The consensus among constitutional lawyers is that Britain is now in uncharted territory, operating in a grey area where written law, unwritten convention and centuries of precedent all clash in contradictory ways. Some scholars argue that the King's action, while technically legal under ancient statutes that were never repealed, violates the fundamental constitutional convention that the monarch acts only on the advice of ministers and doesn't exercise independent political judgment. Others contend that constitutional conventions can evolve and that the existence of the royal assent power implies it can be used. Otherwise, it should have been formally abolished long ago.